The Arizona sun hung in the sky, like a brass coin someone had heated with a blowtorch, radiating waves of punishment across the Sonoran desert floor. At Yuma Proving Ground, where the United States military tested weapons too destructive for civilized places, the temperature gauge outside the observation bunker read 115 degrees Fahrenheit, the kind of heat that made metal too hot to touch with bare hands, the kind that turned breathing into conscious labor, the kind that created optical illusions called mirages, where light bent through superheated air and made the world appear to melt at its edges. 13 men stood in a ragged line across the firing range, their boots planted in sand that could blister skin through leather. These were not ordinary soldiers. These were ghosts who lived in classified files and operated in countries where America officially had no presence. 5 Navy SEAL snipers, 4 Marine Scout snipers, 2 Delta Force operators, 2 Army Rangers. Between them, they held over 200 confirmed kills across deserts in Iraq, mountains in Afghanistan, jungles in Colombia, where operations never made the evening news. They had come for what the military called the Impossible Shot Challenge, a test that existed at the intersection of human capability and pure physics, a demonstration that some targets lay beyond even elite reach. The target sat 4,000 meters downrange, 2.5 miles. A steel plate measuring 24 inches square positioned on the far side of a canyon that carved through the desert like an ancient wound. At that distance, through air that shimmered and danced with heat, the target appeared smaller than a postage stamp held at arm's length. The human eye could barely perceive it as anything more than a dark smudge against sandstone cliffs. The human hand, even guided by the finest rifles American engineering could build, had never successfully struck it under combat conditions. Until today, 13 of the deadliest men in America would try. The wind blew cross range at 18 miles per hour, gusting unpredictably to 25. Anemometers mounted at 500-meter intervals told part of the story, but wind at 4,000 meters was a different creature entirely. It did not obey measurements taken at the firing line. It lived its own life out there in the canyon, swirling through geological formations that had been sculpting airflow for 10 million years before any human arrived with instruments and ambition. Humidity measured 8%. So dry that lips cracked and throats burned with each inhalation. These were the worst possible conditions for precision shooting, which was exactly the point. Wars were not fought in climate-controlled facilities. They were fought in places where nature itself seemed hostile to human intention. They were fought in the kind of heat that made a man question whether the target he was aiming at actually existed or was just another trick the desert played on visitors foolish enough to challenge it. Colonel Wardell Crane stood before the assembled shooters. His uniform pressed despite the oppressive heat. His posture military perfect despite 58 years of gravity pulling at his spine. He had spent 40 years in the Army, and most of them teaching young men how to kill from distances so great the enemy never heard the shot that ended them. He believed in standards. He believed in tradition. He believed that some things should remain sacred, unchanged by the politics of a world that seemed to shift faster than he could track. Crane had presided over 7 previous impossible shot challenges. In those 7 attempts spanning nearly a decade, 49 elite shooters had fired 98 rounds at the 4,000-meter target. Not one had connected. The target bore scars from near misses, dents, and scratches that told stories of extraordinary skill, falling just short of extraordinary achievement. But its center remained unmarked, untouched, a steel testament to the limits of human capability. Gentleman, Crane began, his voice carrying the authority of 4 decades in command. You represent the finest long-range marksmen in the United States military. Each of you has made shots in combat that most men would consider impossible. Today, you face a different challenge. No enemy fire, no time pressure, just you, your rifle, and a target that has defeated every shooter who has ever attempted it. He paused, letting the weight of that statement settle over them like the desert heat itself. The rules are simple. Each shooter receives 2 rounds. 50 caliber BMG, 750 grain Hornady AMAX. You will use identical Macmillan TAC-50 rifles. Identical Schmidt and Bender scopes. No excuses about equipment. This is pure skill against pure physics. The men nodded. They understood. At 4,000 meters, a bullet would be in flight for nearly 8 seconds. 8 seconds, where the Earth's rotation would push it 36 inches to the right. Where wind would shove it left or right, depending on gusts, no computer could predict with certainty. Where gravity would pull it down over 400 feet, even as the shooter aimed impossibly high to compensate. Where heat mirage would make the target appear to be somewhere it was not. An optical lie that fooled the eye and betrayed the mind. 8 seconds where 1,000 variables could turn a perfect shot into a failure measured in feet rather than inches. One more thing, Crane said, and something in his tone made the men look up from their private calculations and quiet preparations. We have 14 shooters today. Not 13. A murmur rippled through the line. Confusion mixed with curiosity. The competition had strict entry requirements. Only the most elite units received invitations. Only shooters with proven combat records qualified. Every name on the roster had been vetted through channels that did not officially exist, approved by commanders who did not officially command the units these men did not officially belong to. There was no room for a 14th. There had never been a 14th. Gentlemen, Crane's voice carried an edge, now something between resignation and challenge. Chief Ilara Kincaid. From the back of the observation area, a figure moved. For 20 minutes. Somehow impossibly not for 20 minutes. Somehow impossibly not one of them had noticed her presence until this exact moment. She had occupied the space the way a shadow occupies a corner. Present but unregistered. Existing but unremarked. As if her stillness itself had rendered her invisible to men trained to detect threats at distances measured in miles. She wore the same desert camouflage they did. The Navy SEAL trident insignia on her chest caught sunlight like a challenge thrown at the feet of every assumption in that line. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight braid that left nothing loose, nothing to catch wind or distract from the work ahead. Her face showed no expression beyond professional composure. The kind of composure that was not performed but inhabited. She was maybe 5 feet 6 inches tall, perhaps 130 pounds, and she looked about as dangerous as someone's high school English teacher. Chief Petty Officer Ilara Kincaid stepped forward, her boots making no sound on the concrete, her movements economical and precise in a way that suggested she never wasted energy on unnecessary motion. Every step served a purpose. Every gesture had been stripped of excess. She did not meet anyone's eyes. She did not scan the line for approval or hostility. She simply took her place at the end, 14th in sequence. Last to shoot. The silence that followed carried weight like a physical presence. It pressed against eardrums. It thickened the already brutal air. 13 men stared at a woman who did not stare back. And in that asymmetry lay the first fracture in the day's assumptions. Lieutenant Brogan Hale broke the silence first. He was 37 years old. Muscular in the way men become when they have spent half their lives in gyms, and the other half in combat zones where muscle meant the difference between carrying a wounded brother to extraction or leaving him behind. SEAL Team 7. 94 confirmed kills across Iraq and Afghanistan had given him confidence that bordered on arrogance, though he would have called it earned certainty. His face tanned to leather by years of sun and wind, in places the American public would never know he had operated, showed the kind of conviction that came from surviving situations that killed lesser men. Hale had made a shot at 1,600 meters in Helmand Province that was still discussed in quiet rooms, where quiet men analyzed extraordinary violence. He had killed 3 enemy fighters, with 3 consecutive rounds in Ramadi, during a sandstorm so thick visibility dropped to 50 meters, engaging targets through thermal optics, with the kind of precision that earned legends. He was by any conventional measure one of the most lethal snipers alive. And he was looking at Ilara Kincaid the way a man looks at something he cannot categorize. Something that does not fit the framework he has spent his entire adult life constructing. Sir Hale addressed Crane but kept his eyes on Ilara. With all due respect, this is the impossible shot challenge. The finest military snipers in the world compete here. This is not a recruiting poster opportunity. Other men nodded. Not all of them, but enough. The gesture rippled down the line like wind through wheat heads dipping in agreement jaws, setting in the particular way that indicated consensus forming around an objection no one wanted to voice first, but everyone was willing to second. Crane's jaw tightened. He had expected this, had been warned it would happen, had argued against it himself before being overruled by Naval Special Warfare Command, which had reviewed Kincaid's classified performance file and decided that her presence was not a gesture, but a test of something the military needed to understand. Chief Kincaid was invited by Naval Special Warfare Command based on her combat record and demonstrated capability. She earned her place here the same way you did, Lieutenant, by being among the best. The best. Hale's laugh carried contempt wrapped in professional courtesy, the thin veneer of respect required by rank structure barely containing the dismissal underneath. Sir, I mean no disrespect to Chief Kincaid. I am sure she is a competent operator. But we are talking about a 4,000-meter shot in conditions that would challenge the greatest snipers in history. This requires... And what exactly does it require, Lieutenant? The voice came from behind them, sharp as a rifle crack. Every head turned. Master Chief Silas Holden walked toward them with the careful gait of a man whose knees had absorbed too many parachute landings, whose back had carried too many wounded brothers across too many hostile landscapes, whose body kept meticulous score of every firefight, every hard landing, every night spent prone on frozen ground or baking rock across 40 years of service that most Americans would never know had been rendered on their behalf. He was 67 years old. His face was weathered leather, carved by wind and sun, and time into something resembling a topographical map of every hard place the American military had operated in since 1984. His eyes were pale blue, the color of winter sky over frozen plains. And when those eyes locked onto Lieutenant Brogan Hale, the younger man actually took a step backward, an involuntary retreat that his body executed before his pride could countermand the order. Silas Holden wore no uniform. Retired 8 months now, officially separated from the institution that had defined his existence since he was 17 years old, and had walked into a Marine Corps recruiting station in Billings, Montana, with nothing but a high school diploma and the ability to shoot the wings off a dragonfly at 300 yards. But everyone on that range knew exactly who he was. Rattler Holden. The legend. The ghost who had operated in places that did not exist on official maps, who had made shots that existed only in classified after-action reports that fewer than 50 people in the world had clearance to read. 156 confirmed kills across the First Gulf War, in 1991 Somalia, in 93 Afghanistan, in the early 2000s Iraq training missions from 2006 through 2008. The man who had trained 3 generations of Marine Scout snipers and SEAL team marksmen. 40 years of creating the deadliest shooters America could produce. And he was furious. Not the loud fury of men who had never learned to control their emotions. The quiet kind. The dangerous kind. The kind that came from decades of channeling rage into precision, of converting anger into the controlled stillness required to kill a man from a mile away without your heartbeat disturbing the rifle. Master Chief? Hale found his voice, though it lacked its earlier confidence. The word came out thinner than he intended, stripped of its previous authority by the presence of a man whose reputation alone could silence a room. I meant no disrespect. I am simply stating the obvious physical reality. You are stating your assumptions, Lieutenant. There is a difference. And in my experience, assumptions have killed more operators than enemy fire ever has. Silas stopped 3 feet from Hale, close enough that the younger man could smell decades of gun oil and desert sand embedded in the older man's skin, in his pores, in the fabric of who he had become over 40 years of living in places where the only things that mattered were precision, patience, and the willingness to wait longer than any reasonable person would wait for the single moment when a trigger pull would change the course of events half a mile away. Chief Kincaid completed 3 combat tours in Afghanistan, Silas said, and his voice carried the weight of a man reciting scripture. 71 confirmed kills. Longest confirmed shot 2,430 meters. Under fire. Incoming rounds impacting within 15 meters of her position while she maintained the focus required to thread a bullet through wind and distance and the chaos of men trying to kill her. He paused. Let that settle. She saved 28 SEALs from a Taliban ambush in the Kandahar Valley using skills you have not learned yet and apparently lack the humility to recognize you need. Skills I spent 8 years teaching her. Skills that require something beyond physical strength and loud confidence. Silas's voice dropped lower. More dangerous. The way a river gets quieter before it reaches the falls. I trained her for 8 years, Lieutenant. I watched her do things with a rifle that I spent 4 decades trying to teach men who thought they already knew everything. Men who looked exactly like you, talked exactly like you, questioned exactly the way you are questioning now. So when you stand here and doubt her capability based on what exactly? Her size, her gender. The fact that she does not look like what you think a sniper is supposed to look like, you are not questioning her. You are revealing your own limitations. Hale's face reddened, but he held Silas's gaze. Give the man credit for that. Lesser men had looked away from those eyes within seconds. Hale lasted nearly 10. I just think that. Then stop thinking and start watching. Silas interrupted with the finality of a door closing. You might learn the difference between competence and arrogance before this day ends. Though I would not bet money on it. He turned his back on Hale. A gesture of dismissal that stung worse than any words could have, because it communicated something words could not. That Brogan hail was not worth the energy of continued attention. That the conversation was over, not because it had been resolved, but because one party had been deemed unworthy of resolution. Silas walked to where Alara stood quiet and still at the end of the line. He did not speak to her. Did not need to. 8 years of working together had built a vocabulary that existed beyond language. A communication system constructed from shared experience and mutual trust. And thousands of hours lying prone on shooting ranges and mountainsides and rooftops in countries where silence was not a preference, but a survival requirement. He simply stood beside her, close enough that his presence communicated a message to every man on that range. She is mine. I trained her. Doubt her at your peril. Alara did not acknowledge his presence with any visible gesture. She simply continued standing the way she had been standing since she arrived. Still, quiet. Her eyes tracking things the other shooters had not thought to observe. The way sand lifted in thin curtains across the desert floor 30 meters to the east, revealing ground-level wind patterns that the anemometers mounted on poles 8 feet above the surface could not detect. The way heat shimmer created distinct layers in the air like looking through stratified glass, each layer bending light at slightly different angles and creating a three-dimensional puzzle of optical distortion that most shooters treated as an obstacle rather than a source of information. She had been reading the desert since she arrived 3 hours before the competition officially began, walking the perimeter of the range in the pre-dawn darkness, feeling the sand under her boots shift as temperature changed, watching the first thermals of the day rise from rock faces as the sun climbed, noting how the canyon channeled wind in patterns that repeated with the regularity of breathing if you watched long enough to see the rhythm beneath the apparent chaos. Nobody had noticed her doing this because nobody had been looking for someone doing this. They had been checking equipment, calibrating scopes, running ballistic calculations on devices that cost more than most Americans earned in a month, preparing the way elite shooters always prepared, with technology, with data, with the mechanical precision of men who trusted instruments over instinct because instruments could be verified and instinct could not. Alara had prepared differently. She had prepared by listening. The observation area fell into tense silence. The kind that precedes violence or revelation, where the air itself seems to compress with anticipation. Colonel Crane cleared his throat. Shooter 1, you are on the line. Let us begin. The first shooter was a SEAL Team 2 operator, 15 years in the teams, a veteran of operations across the Middle East whose name appeared in no public records, but was spoken with respect in quiet rooms, where quiet men discussed violent work that kept civilians safe, without civilians ever knowing it had been necessary. He approached the firing line with confidence born from a decade and a half of making shots that other men called impossible. He settled behind the Macmillan TAC-50, a rifle that weighed nearly 30 pounds and fired bullets the size of a man's finger. The 50 caliber BMG round could punch through engine blocks, destroy light armored vehicles, kill from distances that seemed to violate physics itself. In the right hands, it was a surgical instrument. In the wrong hands, it was just an expensive way to miss. The shooter checked his data. Wind speed at the firing line 18 miles per hour, gusting to 22, temperature 115 degrees, humidity 8%. He consulted his Kestrel 5700 Elite weather meter feeding data into the applied ballistics computer. The device calculated windage, elevation, Coriolis effect, spin, drift, everything. Physics could predict and reduce to numbers. He made his adjustments. Breathed. Settled. Found the stillness that every sniper sought the moment when body and rifle merged into a single system, and the world contracted to the small circle visible through magnified optics. Squeezed. The rifle roared, a sound like a small explosion that echoed across the desert and sent shockwaves through the heat mirage. Through spotting scopes, observers watched the trace, the faint distortion in air that marked the bullet's supersonic passage. 7.8 seconds later, dust erupted from the canyon wall. 4 feet left of target. Miss. The shooter adjusted his scope. Calculated again. The wind had shifted during the bullet's flight. Or maybe the mirage had fooled his eyes, showing him a target that existed 12 inches from where the steel actually sat. Second shot. Same careful preparation. Same controlled breathing. The rifle spoke again. 2.5 feet right of target. Closer. But in precision, shooting closer meant nothing. A miss was a miss. Whether you failed by inches or miles, the enemy stayed alive and your mission ended the same way. The shooter stood, frustration evident in the set of his shoulders. He walked back to the observation area without looking at anyone. His silence said what his words would not. He had done everything correctly, and the desert had not cared. 13 men watched. One woman watched, but she watched differently. Shooter 2 approached the line. Marine Corps distinguished marksman. A man who had made shots in Somalia that people still discussed in hushed tones among those who carried clearances high enough to know what had actually happened in Mogadishu beyond what the movies showed. He was methodical where the first shooter had been instinctive. He trusted numbers the way some men trusted prayer, with complete faith that the system would deliver salvation if the practitioner was faithful enough. First shot, short by 75 meters. The bullet impacted the canyon floor, sending up a plume of dust that looked like a small mortar strike. The round had not even reached the target. Gravity had claimed it before it could close the distance. Second shot, over by 30 meters, impacting the canyon rim above the target. 2 misses, 2 failures. The Marine stood and walked back with the measured stride of a man who refused to let disappointment alter his bearing. Shooter 3. Delta Force. 20 years in special operations. A man whose face was literally classified, whose existence in certain countries was officially denied. He approached the line with the economy of movement that characterized operators who had learned that wasted energy was wasted life. 2 misses. 1 left, 1 right. Separated by 6 feet of empty air on opposite sides of the target. He stared at the canyon wall for a long moment before standing as if the rock itself owed him an explanation for how 2 precisely aimed rounds could land in such contradictory locations. Shooter 4. Army Ranger. Veteran of more firefights than he could count. Survivor of ambushes that killed harder men. Possessor of a silver star and 2 purple hearts, and the particular kind of confidence that came from having been shot at and missed so many times that you began to believe the universe had decided to keep you alive for a reason. 2 misses, both short. Gravity winning its eternal fight against trajectory, pulling his bullets into sand and stone before they could complete their journey. Shooter 5. SEAL Team 6. A man whose name could not be spoken in public, whose missions existed only in files marked with classifications beyond top secret. He had been part of operations that altered the geopolitical landscape of entire regions without a single news organization ever reporting what had actually happened. His hands were steady. His preparation was flawless. His confidence was earned across a career that would never be documented in any book available to the public. 2 misses, close enough to make the observers lean forward in their seats. Far enough to confirm that close was not the same as successful. Shooter 6, another Marine. 30 years of service across 3 conflicts. Gray at the temples and weathered in the way that men who have spent decades outdoors in extreme conditions become weathered. He carried himself with the dignity of someone who had nothing left to prove and was here because the craft itself still mattered to him. 2 misses, both within 8 feet of the target. Impressive by any standard except the one that counted. One by one, the finest military snipers in America faced the 4,000-meter shot. One by one, they failed. Wind that shifted between measurement and impact. Heat mirage that bent light and lied about target location. The Earth's rotation invisible but inexorable, pushing bullets sideways through space as the planet turned beneath them with the indifference of a force that did not know or care that men were trying to accomplish something remarkable on its surface. Silas watched each attempt with the analytical eye of a man who had spent 40 years teaching this craft. He saw the mistakes before they manifested as misses. Saw shooters trusting their scopes when they should have been trusting the environment. Saw them measuring conditions at their position and assuming those conditions would hold across 2.5 miles of atmosphere that followed its own rules. Beside him, Alara stood motionless, her face revealing nothing, but she was not watching the target. Her eyes tracked other things entirely. The way sand lifted and swirled in patterns across the desert floor at 300 meters, at 800, at 1500, each distance showing different wind behavior, different thermal effects, different relationships between ground and air that told a story about what was happening in the invisible space between barrel and target. The way heat shimmer created layers in the atmosphere, each layer a different temperature, a different density, bending light and bullets in ways that instruments could measure at one location but could not predict across the full distance. She watched the way distant canyon walls absorbed solar radiation on their eastern faces and radiated thermal energy in rhythms visible only to those who knew how to see them. Stone heated by morning sun created rising columns of air that disrupted anything passing through them. She was reading a language the others did not speak. A language her father had taught her in the mountains of Montana before she was old enough to understand why it mattered. A language Silas had refined over 8 years of patient instruction. A language that existed in the space between measurement and understanding. Shooter 7 stepped to the line. Lieutenant Brogan Hale. SEAL Team 7. 94 confirmed kills. The loudest voice in the line. The man who had questioned Alara's presence. He took his time. Made a show of his preparation. Checking and rechecking calculations with exaggerated precision. He glanced back once at Alara. A look that said without words what his mouth had already said with them. Watch how a professional does this. But before he settled fully behind the rifle, Alara spoke. Her voice was quiet, barely carrying across the concrete platform. The kind of voice that did not compete with ambient sound but somehow cut through it the way a razor cuts through cloth. In the desert, silence, every word landed like a stone dropped into still water. You are aiming where the mirage shows it, Lieutenant, not where the steel actually is. Hale froze. For a moment, genuine anger flashed across his face. Then he forced it down, replaced it with professional dismissal. He positioned himself, refusing to acknowledge her words. First shot. The rifle thundered. 7.8 seconds of flight time. Impact. 3 feet high, 2 feet right. His confidence cracked like sun-baked earth. He adjusted, his breathing pattern becoming less controlled, his movements less certain, doubt infiltrating the mechanical precision he had always relied upon. Second shot. Miss. 2 feet left, 1 foot low. The opposite quadrant from his first attempt. As if the desert were deliberately distributing his failure across all 4 points of the compass. Hale stood slowly, his face burning red. Not from heat, from humiliation deeper than any physical wound. He had talked the loudest question the hardest, and failed in the exact way Alara had predicted. As he walked back past her, he kept his eyes forward. Jaw clenched, unable or unwilling to meet her gaze. Though she was not looking at him anyway. She was watching the wind flags at the 2,000-meter mark, noting how they moved in rhythms the ballistic computer could not capture. In cycles that repeated with the regularity of breathing, if you had the patience to watch long enough to see the chest rise and fall. 8 shooters down, 5 to go. Each failure added weight to the atmosphere. These were apex predators of the military sniper world, and they were being humbled by distance and wind and the sheer audacity of attempting something that existed at the far edge of what the human body and mind could accomplish. Shooters 9 and 10 failed with quiet dignity. They made their attempts with full effort and accepted their results with composure that honored the difficulty of what they had attempted. Shooter 11. Delta Force. 18 years of covert operations. A man who had made shots that defied belief in environments that defied acknowledgement. He approached the firing line without arrogance, just the quiet certainty of someone who respected the magnitude of what he was attempting. He spent 5 full minutes preparing, methodical, careful. First shot. Through the spotting scopes, observers saw something that made hearts stop. Dust erupting just 5 inches left of target center. Closer than anyone else had come. Dramatically, heartbreakingly closer. Close enough to suggest that impossibility had a boundary. A murmur rippled through the observation area. He could do it. On the second shot with that adjustment, he could actually hit it. The Delta operator made a micro adjustment. Quarter minute of angle. He settled back in. Breathing controlled. Mind focused. Second shot. The rifle thundered. 7.8 seconds. Every eye on the range watching through optics. Impact. 9 inches right. Opposite side from the first shot. Miss. The operator stood slowly. And for the first time that day, someone spoke what everyone had been thinking. The wind is not consistent. There is a pattern, but it is organic. It cycles in a way I cannot model. I cannot predict it with the tools I have. He walked back. And though he had failed, there was respect in how the other shooters looked at him. He had come closest. He had proven it might be possible. He just could not make the final leap. While he spoke, Alara's eyes tracked the wind flags again. Noted the timing between gusts. Counted seconds in her head with the precision of someone who had been counting wind cycles since she was 8 years old, standing on a Montana ridge with her father, learning that the invisible world was more important than the visible one. A small nod, almost imperceptible. She had found the pattern. Shooters 12 and 13 approached with less confidence than their predecessors. They both failed, both missing by margins that would have been impressive at any other distance, but here represented just more evidence in a growing case for impossibility. The sun had moved across the sky. 2 hours had passed. 13 of the world's finest military snipers had fired 26 rounds at a target 4,000 meters away. 26 failures. The atmosphere hung heavy with frustration and wounded pride. These were men accustomed to success, accustomed to being the best at what they did, and they had been beaten by the indifferent physics of a universe that did not care how many kills they had confirmed. Colonel Wardell Crane stepped forward, preparing to call the competition, to acknowledge that perhaps the impossible shot had earned its name for a reason. He drew breath to speak. "Sir." The voice was quiet, understated, almost lost in the desert wind. But it stopped Crane mid-breath as completely as if someone had pressed a hand over his mouth. Elara Kincaid had spoken for the second time that day. She stepped forward from the end of the line, moving with a grace that seemed incongruous with the military precision surrounding her. No swagger, no confidence display. Just a woman walking toward a rifle with the quiet certainty of someone who already knew what was going to happen next. Chief Kincaid, Crane said, "You are number 14. You are up." Brogan Hale could not help himself. The words came out before better judgment could stop them. "Sir, with all due respect, if 13 of us could not make this shot, what logical basis exists for believing?" Silas Holden's voice cut through like a blade through silk. Not loud, just absolutely certain. "Close your mouth and open your eyes, Lieutenant. You might learn something before this day ends." Hale fell silent, but his skepticism radiated from him like heat from sun-baked stone. Elara reached the firing line, looked down at the rifle, then looked up at the desert stretching away toward a target that sat 2.5 miles distant. And she did something that made every observer pause. Something that would be discussed in military sniper communities for years to come. She reached down and removed her boots, bare feet on the Arizona sand. Men exchanged glances, confusion rippling through the group. Was this some kind of ritual? Some psychological preparation technique they had never encountered? Or was the pressure already breaking her before she had even touched the rifle? Silas spoke softly to Colonel Crane, though his voice carried intentionally to every man in the observation area. "She is reading ground vibration signatures, thermal differential through skin contact, gathering data that boots would filter out." Crane searched for words. "That is not standard procedure, Master Chief." "No, sir, it is not." Silas's eyes swept the line of failed shooters, each one standing with the particular posture of men who had just discovered the limits of standard procedure. Standard procedure just failed 13 times. Watch what non-standard looks like. Elara stood motionless on concrete that had to be scalding, but her face showed no discomfort, only concentration that seemed to pull her away from the physical world into something deeper, something that existed beyond pain or heat or the weight of 13 failures pressing against the air around her. Something her father had first shown her on a mountain ridge in Montana when she was 8 years old, and the world was still simple enough that a little girl could close her eyes and feel the wind change direction 3 seconds before it happened, and believe that this was the most natural thing in the world. Because it was. The men watched her stand barefoot on burning concrete and did not know what they were seeing. Some saw weakness, a woman cracking under pressure. Some saw theater, a performance designed to create narrative around inevitable failure. Some saw something they could not name, something that made them uneasy, in the way that witnessing the unfamiliar always makes confident men uneasy. Silas saw none of these things. He saw a hunter entering the final phase of a stalk that had begun 3 hours before any of them arrived. Elara stood motionless, eyes closed, arms loose at her sides, feet planted on concrete that had been absorbing Arizona's sun since dawn, radiating thermal energy upward through the soles of her bare feet and into nerve endings that most people had trained themselves to ignore. Through her feet, she could feel the micro-tremors caused by wind pressure against the concrete platform. The way gusts created pressure differentials that made the earth itself flex in patterns too subtle for instruments, but perceptible to bare skin pressed against heated stone. Through her face turned slightly into the breeze, she felt wind speed variations as temperature changes on her cheeks. Faster air cooled exposed skin fractionally more than slower air. The difference was measured in fractions of degrees, meaningless to anyone not trained to interpret it. But Elara had spent 10,000 hours on ranges and mountainsides and rooftops learning to read those fractions the way a musician reads quarter tones that untrained ears cannot distinguish. Through her closed eyes, she saw nothing. And in seeing nothing, she perceived everything. The desert spoke to her in a language she had learned before she learned algebra, before she learned to drive, before she learned that the world would spend most of her adult life telling her that what she could do was impossible or insufficient. The wind moved across her skin in patterns that repeated. Not identically. Nature never repeated identically, but with the recognizable rhythm of a living system, cycling through states, the way a heart cycles through contractions and relaxations. She counted 1, 2, 3. The wind built from the southwest, accelerating across open desert floor. 7. Peak velocity. She felt it in the pressure against her right cheek, in the way her braid shifted against her back. 8, 9, 12. Turbulence. The gust breaking apart against the canyon rim 2,000 meters out, fragmenting into chaotic subcurrents that swirled and collided. This was the zone where bullets died, where perfect calculations met imperfect reality, and reality won. 20, 25, 30. The chaos continuing. Wind flags at various distances telling different stories, pointing different directions. 35. Something shifting. The turbulence beginning to organize itself. The first suggestion of calm, the way storm clouds thin at their edges before blue sky appears. 43. Stability. Relative, temporary, imperfect, but real. The wind settling into something approaching consistency. 51. The cycle resetting. New gust building. Alara opened her eyes. The pattern was clear. 51-second cycles. Gust peak at 7 seconds. Turbulence from 8 to 35. Settling phase from 36 to 42. Stable window from 43 to 51. Duration of the optimal shooting window, 7.4 seconds. Barely long enough for a bullet to cover 4,000 meters before the atmosphere returned to chaos. Barely long enough. But enough. She looked at Silas. A small nod. Imperceptible to anyone who did not know the language they had built together. The nod said everything. I found it. Silas's lined face showed the faintest smile. The expression of a teacher watching a student arrive at an understanding the teacher had spent a lifetime pursuing and never fully achieved. 1 minute had passed since Alara removed her boots, then 2, then 5. The men shifted their weight, exchanged glances that communicated shared impatience. She is stalling. Brogan Hale's voice carried across the concrete. The pressure is getting to her. She knows she cannot make the shot, and she is delaying the inevitable. She is hunting. Silas's voice carried a controlled anger now. Hot enough to cut steel, but focused enough to leave everything else untouched. Wind does not communicate in data streams, Lieutenant. It speaks in whispers, in patterns, in rhythms that instruments flatten into numbers and numbers strip of meaning. She is learning its dialect, something you apparently never mastered despite 94 kills. 6 minutes. Then Alara moved. She walked to the rifle the way a pianist walks to a concert grand. No hurry, no hesitation. Every step calibrated to maintain the internal stillness she had spent 6 minutes building. Her bare feet made no sound on the concrete. She settled into prone position with movements that looked more like meditation than military procedure. Her hands touched the Macmillan TAC-50 with something approaching reverence. The recognition of a tool's capability and the respect owed to any instrument asked to perform at the absolute boundary of its design. The men watched. Their skepticism now mixed with curiosity. Maybe even hope. 13 failures had created a hunger for success that transcended ego and competition, and the question of who achieved it. Silas knelt beside her, his old knees protesting against concrete that had been cooking all day. Talk to me, Ghost. The nickname. Her call sign. The name Silas had given her during their first year of training together, after he realized that she could be present in a room for an hour without anyone registering her existence. She disappeared not by hiding, but by being so still that human pattern recognition simply edited her out of conscious awareness. Her voice when it came was soft, but carried absolute certainty. The voice of someone who had moved past guessing into knowing. Wind cycles every 51 seconds. Master Chief, gust peaks at the 7-second mark. Turbulence from 8 to 35 seconds. Stable settling from 43 to 51. Window duration 7.4 seconds. Silas's eyes showed recognition. This was not memorized data being recited. This was real-time environmental analysis at a level that existed beyond anything in any training manual he had ever written or read. Mirage refraction. Alara continued without pause, her eye pressed to the scope, but her attention distributed across every sense simultaneously. Heat rising in columns every 28 seconds from the basalt outcroppings at 1900 meters creates optical displacement of the target. Current sun angle 44 degrees western descent. Displacement calculates 14.2 inches leftward at current thermal column intensity. But if I time the bullet's transit through that zone during thermal column dissipation, when the heated air column is collapsing rather than rising, refraction minimizes to 2.8 inches. Silas sat back on his heels. His eyes showed something between pride and wonder. Ghost. That is PhD-level atmospheric analysis. No ballistic calculator on Earth incorporates thermal column cycling into firing solutions. Montana taught me, Master Chief. 10,000 hours watching wind move across valleys, where it behaved differently at every altitude. Learning that textbook physics captures 80% of reality. The final 20% requires feeling it, becoming part of the system instead of trying to dominate it from outside. Then she said something that made Silas's breath catch. Master Chief, I am not shooting for center mass on the first shot. The silence that followed was complete and absolute. Explain, Silas said. I need empirical confirmation of wind behavior at target location. Flag data at 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 meters provides inference about conditions at 4,000. Inference, not certainty. First shot impact will show me the actual wind vector at the target zone. The dust pattern, the displacement from aim point, the direction and magnitude of drift. No sensor at any intermediate position can give me that data. Only a bullet arriving at the target location and revealing what it encountered along the way. She paused. First shot is reconnaissance. I am not wasting it. I am investing it. Silas understood immediately. The tactical elegance cut through decades of conventional training and illuminated a truth so simple it was almost invisible. Every other shooter had tried to succeed on both shots, hoping that adjustment would compensate for the gap between predicted and actual conditions. But a miss only told you that your prediction was wrong. It did not tell you precisely how real conditions differed. You are going to intentionally miss to guarantee the second shot hits. Yes, Master Chief. Trade 1 round for certainty. Every other shooter today traded 2 rounds for hope. Colonel Wardell Crane had been listening. He stepped closer. Chief Kincaid, you are telling me you intend to waste your first round on a deliberate miss. Elara's eyes met his. Calm, professional, certain. Negative, sir. I am eliminating guesswork through tactical reconnaissance. Every shooter today failed because they guessed about conditions at the target location based on measurements taken at intermediate positions. The canyon creates discontinuities. Thermal columns create disruptions. And the only way to know what is actually happening at 4,000 meters is to send something there and observe what happens to it. I am not wasting a round, sir. I am removing the guess. Brogan Hale was shaking his head. This is rationalization. Preparation for inevitable failure. A story she can tell afterward. Silas stood, turned to face Hale with an expression that made the lieutenant take a full step backward. One more word, Lieutenant, and I will have you removed from the observation area. Chief Kincaid has forgotten more about long-range precision than you have learned in 15 years of shooting at distances where this level of understanding was never required. Show respect, or show yourself out. Hale shut his mouth. Elara settled into prone position. Her body became a biological machine optimized for a single purpose, every component aligned and calibrated. Hips aligned with spine. Left leg extended straight. Right knee bent slightly for stability. Left hand supporting the rifle's fore end with exactly enough pressure to stabilize without introducing tension. Right hand wrapped around the pistol grip with precisely calibrated force. Enough to control, not enough to create muscle tremor. Her breathing cycle initiated. 4 deep breaths to oxygenate blood and settle her nervous system. Then the combat breathing pattern Silas had drilled into her until it became as automatic as heartbeat. Inhale for 4 seconds. Hold for 2. Exhale for 6. The extended exhale triggering the parasympathetic nervous system, lowering heart rate, creating the internal stillness that precision at extreme distance demanded. Through the Schmidt and Bender scope, the world contracted to a circle of magnified reality. The target wavered in the heat mirage, appearing to float and shift like something seen through troubled water. But Elara did not fight the distortion. She observed it, mapped its rhythm, understood its pattern. She waited, motionless, counting. 10 seconds into the wind cycle. 20, 30, Brogan Hale muttered from the observation area. She is freezing, choking under pressure. She is hunting, you damn fool. Silas's voice was barely controlled. Patience is a weapon you have never learned to use because you have always been fast enough to succeed without it. Fast is not enough here. Fast is what got 26 rounds buried in canyon walls today. 44 seconds. Turbulence settling. 47. 49. 50. The window opening. Ilara fired. The massive 50 caliber round exited the barrel at 2,920 feet per second, creating a supersonic shockwave visible in the mirage distortion. The sound reached the observers a fraction later. A roar, a crack, a detonation that echoed across the desert floor and bounced off canyon walls. 7.9 seconds of flight time began. Through spotting scopes, 13 sets of combat veteran eyes tracked the bullet's passage, watched the faint trace cutting through superheated air, saw it arc upward, saw it begin to fall, saw it drift as wind and rotation conspired to push it away from the straight line between barrel and target. Impact. Dust erupted 17 inches left of the target center. Miss. But what a miss. Closer than all but one previous attempt. But Ilara's eyes never left the scope. She was not disappointed. She was analyzing. The dust cloud had told her everything she needed to know. Wind at target location was 4.2 miles per hour, stronger than the 3,000-meter flag indicated. The canyon was funneling air in a way that accelerated it beyond what intermediate measurements could predict. Mirage refraction was 10.8 inches, not 14.2. She had overcompensated for optical displacement. Bullet drop trajectory was perfect. Elevation calculation was flawless. Coriolis compensation was accurate. She needed to adjust windage, only windage, and she knew exactly how much. The recalculation happened in her mind faster than she could have entered it into any computer. Not mathematical in the conventional sense. Spatial. Intuitive. The kind of computation that happened in the part of the brain that caught a thrown ball without solving trajectory equations. She did not touch the scope turrets. Pure Kentucky windage adjustment. Exactly as Silas had taught her in the mountains of Montana, lying prone on a ridge overlooking a valley where wind behaved differently at every elevation, and the only way to hit a target at 1,200 meters was to hold off the crosshairs and trust your understanding of where the bullet would actually go. Turrets are mechanical, Silas had told her years ago. Mechanical things have tolerances, lag, imprecision in every click, but your brain is computational. It processes corrections in real time. Trust your brain over your tools when data updates mid-mission. She had trusted her brain, and her brain had delivered a firing solution that no computer on Earth could have generated because no computer had access to the data her first shot had just provided. Brogan Hale laughed from the observation area, the sound harsh in the desert air. There it is. Even she admits defeat. If the so-called best female sniper cannot make the shot, then maybe we can all agree. Silas turned on him with a fury that made every man in the observation area step away from them both. Lieutenant, that woman just accomplished more with one deliberate shot than you did with 2 desperate attempts. She gathered actionable intelligence about conditions at the target location, something no one else thought to do. You fired hoping to hit. She fired knowing she would miss and learning from it. Watch what she does with that knowledge before you embarrass yourself any further. Ilara was already reloading. 1 round remaining. 1 opportunity. 1 chance to do what 13 of the finest military snipers in America could not. 750 grains of copper-jacketed lead slid into the chamber with a sound like a whisper. She closed the bolt. Felt the round seat itself against the chamber walls. Felt the rifle become complete again. The wind blew across the desert. The sun beat down. The target sat 4,000 meters away. Small, distant, unmarked. Waiting. Ilara settled deeper into prone. Her world narrowing, contracting, collapsing inward until nothing existed except the crosshairs and the aim point and the space between them. She began counting the wind cycle. Fresh count. 10 seconds. The gust building, wind accelerating, flag snapping, sand lifting in thin curtains that caught sunlight and turned golden. 20 seconds. Turbulence and full chaos. 30 seconds. Still chaotic, but the first hints of organization appearing. 35. Settling beginning. 40. Almost there. Her breathing had slowed to something barely perceptible. 3 breaths per minute. Heart rate down to 41 beats per minute. Visible in the steady pulse at her throat. 44 seconds. The optimal window opening. 7.4 seconds of relative stability. Then something changed. An unexpected gust hit at 46 seconds into what should have been the stable phase. 5 seconds early, an anomaly that violated the pattern she had observed for 95 minutes, the desert breaking its own rules. Every man watching through optics saw the wind flag snap in a direction they should not have snapped, saw sand lift where sand should have been settling, saw the stable window shatter. A lesser shooter would have panicked, would have lifted their head from the scope, cursed the wind, waited for another cycle. Alara did none of these things. In the fraction of a second between the anomalous gust and her conscious mind processing its implications, something deeper took over. Something built from 10,000 hours of watching wind behave in ways textbooks could not predict. Something assembled from a childhood spent on Montana ridges where weather changed without warning, and the only people who survived were the ones who adapted faster than the change. Early gust meant the cycle was resetting ahead of schedule. The pattern was not destroyed. It was shifted, moved forward in time by 5 seconds. The new stable window would occur from 46 to 53 seconds from the current timestamp. Her mind recalculated, adjusted windage compensation for the gust's residual effect, revised thermal column timing. All of this in less than 2 seconds. Without conscious deliberation. Pattern recognition operating at the speed of instinct. Her trigger finger did not lift. The pressure continued building. The world outside the scope ceased to exist. 4 pounds. 4.5. 5. 5.5. Her breathing in respiratory pause. The moment between exhale and inhale when the body achieved maximum stillness. 6 pounds. The trigger broke. The rifle roared with the sound like the world cracking open. The massive 50 caliber round erupted from the barrel at 2,920 feet per second. The recoil slammed into Alara's shoulder, but her body absorbed it like a shock absorber muscles distributing the impact through thousands of repetitions of learned response. Her scope picture barely wavered, and then the waiting began. 7.9 seconds. At 1 second, the round was still climbing, fighting gravity with the momentum of its initial velocity, traveling at a speed that made it more missile than projectile. The copper jacket maintained integrity despite aerodynamic forces trying to tear it apart. The boat tail design providing stability even as air resistance worked to tumble it end over end. Inside, the bullet molecular forces held copper and lead together against stresses that would have shattered lesser construction. This was precision ammunition, engineered for exactly this purpose, designed to hold together across distances that most people could not walk in 30 minutes. At 2 seconds, it reached the apex of its arc, nearly 8 feet above the line of sight. For a fraction of a moment, it hung suspended, neither rising nor falling, balanced between the energy that had launched it and the gravity that would claim it, a bullet in equilibrium. The last moment of certainty before the long fall began. If a camera could have frozen this instant, the round would have appeared motionless against a background of blue sky and heat, shimmer, a small copper object suspended in space by nothing but the mathematics of trajectory and the physics of momentum. At 3 seconds, gravity won. The bullet started its descent, dropping faster as velocity decreased and air resistance compounded the gravitational pull. The descent was not linear. It accelerated, each fraction of a second adding speed in the downward direction while air resistance subtracted speed in the forward direction. The bullet was slowing down and falling faster simultaneously. A race between forward momentum and gravitational pull that gravity would eventually win as it always did, as it always had, as it always would, for every projectile ever launched by every weapon ever built by human hands. At 4 seconds, the bullet crossed the 2,000-meter mark, halfway to the target, passing through air masses of different temperatures and densities that created invisible boundaries in the atmosphere. Wind that measured 15 miles per hour at ground level transformed into 22 at bullet altitude, creating lateral forces that pushed the round sideways through space. The bullet did not resist these forces. It could not. It simply absorbed them into its trajectory, drifting rightward in a curve so gradual that only instruments could detect it, but so significant that at 4,000 meters it would translate into feet of lateral displacement. At 5 seconds, velocity had bled from 2,900 to approximately 1,800 feet per second. The bullet had lost nearly 40% of its speed. The decreased velocity meant increased susceptibility to every force acting upon it. More time for wind to push, more time for gravity to pull, more time for the rotating Earth to carry the target sideways beneath the bullet's path. The round was entering the critical phase where small errors became large misses. where the difference between a hit and a failure was measured in fractions of adjustment, made 2.5 miles away by a woman lying on burning concrete. At 6 seconds, the bullet dropped through the thermal column rising from basalt outcroppings at 1,900 meters. Heated air creating a density change that bent the bullet's path microscopically. A deflection invisible to any observer but significant enough to move the impact point by inches that mattered more than feet at this distance. But Alara had fired during the dissipation phase. The column was collapsing, the heated air dispersing. Deflection was minimal, 2.8 inches instead of 14.2. The difference between the shot she had timed and the shot she had avoided. At 7 seconds, the round had dropped over 400 feet from its initial trajectory, had drifted 39.7 inches right from Coriolis effect as the Earth rotated beneath it, had been pushed an additional 8.3 inches right by wind differential that her reconnaissance shot had revealed, was traveling at approximately 1,200 feet per second, less than half its original velocity, but still faster than the speed of sound, still carrying enough energy to penetrate steel plate, still obeying the trajectory that Alara had calculated, not with instruments, but with understanding. At 7.9 seconds, copper-jacketed lead traveling at 1,180 feet per second arrived at a point in space 19.7 inches right and 1.8 inches high of where a man aiming directly at the target would have placed his crosshairs, which meant it arrived exactly at target center. The sound of copper-jacketed lead striking hardened steel rang across the desert like a church bell, announcing something that transcended the mechanical fact of metal hitting metal. Clear, pure, unmistakable. A tone that cut through wind and distance and disbelief with the clarity of absolute truth. Through 13 spotting scopes, 13 combat veterans saw the same image simultaneously. Impact. Dead center. Perfect hit. The steel plate rocking backward on its mount from the force of a bullet that had traveled 2.5 miles to reach it. For 3 seconds, absolute silence ruled the desert. Then the silence broke. Men leaped to their feet, spotting scopes dropping from hands. Voices rising in disbelief and amazement and raw involuntary excitement that combat veterans rarely allowed themselves to show. She did it. She actually did it. Dead center? I saw it. Perfect hit. That is impossible. That is literally impossible. No one makes that shot. The Delta operator who had come closest stood with his mouth open, staring at the target through his scope as if expecting the impact to disappear. But the mark remained. Perfect. Undeniable. The Marine who had been shooting for 30 years lowered his binoculars with trembling hands. Not from age, from the recognition that he had just witnessed something that redefined his understanding of his own discipline. The SEAL Team 6 operator said it quietly. 5 words that captured what 26 failures and 1 success had revealed. That was art disguised as science. Brogan Hale stood frozen, his face drained of color, his spotting scope locked on the target, his mouth opening and closing without sound. The worldview he had constructed over 15 years quietly falling apart. Grain by grain. Certainty by certainty. Wardell Crane lowered his binoculars slowly. His expression transformed from professional observation into something approaching wonder. In 40 years of military service, 7 previous challenges, 49 shooters, 98 rounds, he had never seen a hit on the 4,000-meter target. He had begun to believe the target's purpose was to remain unhit. To teach humility. He had been wrong. Silas Holden did not move, did not celebrate. He simply watched Alara, who remained in prone position, calmly clearing the weapon with the mechanical precision of someone performing a routine task. Her face showed no triumph, just the quiet satisfaction of someone who had known the outcome before the trigger broke, who had trusted understanding over hope and been rewarded with confirmation rather than surprise. She engaged the safety, removed the magazine, locked the bolt back, verified the chamber was clear. Only then did she stand, her bare feet having spent nearly 15 minutes on concrete hot enough to blister skin. She showed no discomfort as she retrieved her boots. Silas walked to her, extended his weathered hand. She took it. They shook once, firmly, the gesture carrying 8 years of shared history. Chief Kincaid. Silas's voice was rough with emotion he did not bother hiding. In 47 years of military service, 4 decades training snipers, I have never witnessed marksmanship of this caliber. You did not just make an impossible shot. You made it appear inevitable. It was not inevitable, Master Chief. Just necessary. Montana taught me to listen. You taught me to refine what I heard. Afghanistan taught me to trust it. The desert confirmed it. Brogan Hale stepped forward. Every eye turned to him. The loudest skeptic, the harshest critic. What he said now would matter. His face showed struggle, the visible effort of a proud man confronting the gap between who he thought he was and who this day had revealed him to be. Chief Kincaid. His voice was steady but carried weight it had not carried before. I was disrespectful, dismissive, wrong, on all counts. He met her eyes. The effort it cost was visible. You demonstrated mastery that humbles me. I have 94 confirmed combat kills, and I could not make that shot. You are operating at a level I did not know existed. And the fact that I did not know it existed is my failure, not yours. I was wrong about you, about what I thought defined capability. You are one of the finest shooters I have ever witnessed, and I need to learn from that instead of resenting it. Alara extended her hand. Hale took it. The handshake lasted longer than military custom required. Lieutenant, you will make shots I cannot. We all have strengths. The key is recognizing them in ourselves and in others. Then she smiled, small and brief, but genuine. Besides, your doubt made me want to prove you wrong. So thank you for the motivation. Surprised laughter rippled through the group, breaking tension that had been building for 2.5 hours. Even Hale managed a rueful grin. Colonel Crane approached with the formality of official business. Chief Kincaid, your performance today has implications beyond this competition. Naval Special Warfare Command has been observing via satellite feed. They have requested direct communication with you. He held out a satellite phone. Alara took it, stepped away, listened more than she spoke. 3 minutes. When she returned, her expression revealed nothing. Silas raised an eyebrow. They want me at Naval Special Warfare Center. Advanced Sniper Course. Lead Instructor Cadre. Develop curriculum integrating observation-based methodology with traditional ballistics. Silas's slow smile creased the weathered skin around his eyes. Time to pass the torch, Ghost. You have mastered what took me 40 years to learn halfway. Now teach it. Build something that outlives us both. She looked at this man who had been mentor and teacher, and the closest thing to a guiding force she had known since her father died on a Montana mountainside 15 years ago. What about you, Master Chief? You retiring for real this time? Silas's grin widened. I will come teach with you. Not as lead. As your assistant. Senior advisor, they said. Let me learn from you for a change. See what you can teach an old man who spent 4 decades thinking he knew everything and just found out he was 80% right. The sun had moved across the sky. Shadows lengthened. The heat remained but somehow felt less hostile, as if the desert had made peace with the humans who had challenged it. The target sat 4,000 meters distant, bearing a new mark at its center. One woman had done what 13 men could not. Because she had learned to listen when others had learned only to calculate. Because she had the patience to wait when others had only the urgency to act. Because she understood that the final 20% lived in the willingness to become part of the system you were trying to master, rather than standing outside it demanding it obey your instruments. 6 months slid past like water over smooth stone. The Arizona desert faded into memory, replaced by the coastal geography of Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, California. Here, where the Pacific Ocean met the shoreline in an eternal conversation that neither side would ever win. Where salt-laden wind carried the smell of kelp and jet fuel, in equal measure, a different kind of precision was being taught. The Advanced Sniper Course occupied a cluster of nondescript buildings near the base's eastern perimeter. From the outside, nothing suggested the lethal expertise being cultivated within. Just concrete and steel and deliberate anonymity. Inside, classroom 328 students sat in tiered rows. 22 men, 6 women, ages ranging from 23 to 37. All had completed basic sniper training. All had proven capable of shots that would impress civilian marksmen. All believed that technical skill and equipment quality determined outcomes. Chief Petty Officer Alara Kincaid stood at the lectern and let the silence build. She understood that sometimes the most powerful lesson began with the absence of information. That silence created a vacuum, and humans rushed to fill it with attention. At the rear of the classroom, Silas sat in a folding chair. Officially retired. Unofficially serving as senior advisor. He had spent 4 decades teaching snipers. Now he occupied a seat in the back row and watched someone teach the thing he had never quite found words for. He was learning what it felt like to watch a student surpass the teacher. Elite marksmanship transcends physical mechanics. Ilara let that statement hang in the air. You are here because you can shoot. You have proven that. You can calculate windage and elevation. You understand Coriolis effect and spin drift. You know your equipment intimately. You have qualified at ranges that would impress 99% of shooters on Earth. And everything you know is approximately 80% of what you need. Students shifted in their seats. They had worked years to reach this course. And now this woman was telling them they were missing a fifth of something they thought they had mastered. A SEAL from Team 5 raised his hand. 29 years old. Combat veteran across 3 continents. Ma'am, what is the other 20%? Understanding. You calculate, but do you understand what you are calculating? You measure, but do you feel what you are measuring? You dominate the environment, but have you ever tried joining it instead? She walked to the window, gestured toward the Pacific visible in the distance. Out there, wind does not just blow in a direction at a speed. It tells stories about the terrain it has crossed, the thermal patterns it has created, the pressure systems interacting across hundreds of miles. Most shooters see wind as an obstacle. Elite shooters see it as a partner, a source of information more valuable than any instrument, but only if you learn to listen, and listening requires patience. Stillness, the willingness to not act until acting becomes inevitable rather than hopeful. A young woman in the second row spoke. 24 years old. Army Ranger. Tessa Ridley. She had earned her place through performance so consistent that her chain of command recommended her with a single sentence. She does not miss. Chief Kincaid. The ballistic computers calculate all those factors. Wind, temperature, humidity, Coriolis. They give us firing solutions accurate to fractions of an inch. To the limits of their programming, Ilara replied, which assumes static conditions, linear changes, predictable patterns. The computer tells you what should happen based on the data you feed it, but what happens when conditions change during the bullet's flight? What happens when the real world does not match the model? She pulled up video from Yuma, the 13 failed attempts, then her successful shot. Watch shooter 7. Excellent technique, perfect fundamentals, top-tier ballistic calculator. Accurate data measured at his position, and he misses by 3 feet. Now watch what I do differently. The video showed her removing boots, standing barefoot for 6 minutes, eyes closed. I am not meditating. I am gathering data the computer cannot access. Ground vibration, thermal differential through skin contact. But more importantly, I am observing patterns over time. 6 minutes gave me information that 6 seconds of measurement could not. She paused the footage. The wind at Yuma cycled every 51 seconds. Gust peak at 7. Turbulence until 35. Stable window from 43 to 51. No flag, no meter, no computer could tell me that. Only extended observation, only patience. A Delta Force operator leaned forward. 32 years old. Operations on 4 continents. Chief, how do you know the pattern will continue? What if the next cycle breaks the rhythm? You do not know with certainty. You understand probability. A pattern that has repeated 19 times has high likelihood of repeating a 20th. A single measurement tells you nothing about trends, nothing about where conditions are going. She clicked forward to a slide showing wind patterns graphically. This is the difference between a snapshot and a movie, between a data point and a data stream, between measuring and understanding. For 40 minutes, she walked them through environmental reading techniques. How to identify thermal columns by watching heat shimmer. How to predict wind changes by observing how sand moved at different distances, how vegetation bent at different elevations, how shadows shifted on terrain features that channeled airflow. When the lecture ended, she led them outside to the practical range, targets from 300 to 1,200 meters. No shooting today, just observation. Find a position, observe for 20 minutes, map the wind patterns. No instruments, just your senses and your patience. Groans from several students. 20 minutes of watching seemed like wasted time when they had come to shoot. Silas smiled slightly. He had encountered this identical reaction 30 years ago. Young operators wanted trigger time, but the ones who learned patience were the ones whose names appeared in classified reports with the word unprecedented attached. The students spread across the range. Most watched the wind flags. Useful but limited. Almost none watched the environment itself, the actual movement of air across sand and water. After 10 minutes, Ilara stopped beside Tessa Ridley. The young ranger had removed her boots, was sitting cross-legged with her eyes closed and one hand extended palm open to the breeze. What are you sensing? Tessa's eyes remained closed. The wind comes in waves, ma'am. It builds and releases, like breathing. Period of about 40 seconds. Good. What else? Temperature drops slightly when wind speed increases. The gusts are coming from the ocean. Cooler air moving inland. Excellent. What does that tell you about bullet trajectory at 800 meters? Tessa's eyes opened, realization dawning. The cooler air is denser. A bullet will encounter more resistance during high wind phases. So wind drift and air density changes are correlated, not independent variables. The computer treats them as separate inputs, but they are connected. Ilara nodded. Now you are understanding instead of just measuring. Understanding those connections lets you predict combined effects that the calculator cannot compute. She moved to a male student checking his weather meter every 30 seconds. What have you learned? Wind varying between 8 and 14 miles per hour, ma'am. Average 10.7. Temperature 72. Humidity 61. Those are measurements. What have you learned? The confusion was genuine. Look at the terrain between here and 800 meters. What do you see? The student studied the landscape. There is a small ridge at 400 meters, some vegetation. The target is closer to the water. So, wind coming off the ocean will be affected by that ridge. The vegetation will slow ground-level wind, but not wind at bullet height. Proximity to water means different thermal effects at the target than at your position. Understanding flickered. So, my measurements here do not tell me what is happening there, which is why observation of the entire environment beats measurement of your immediate location. Build a picture of the whole battlefield, not just the foxhole you are sitting in. Over the following weeks, the transformation became visible. Students moved slower, thought more, trusted observation over instrumentation without abandoning instrumentation entirely. They began removing boots on the range before Ilara suggested it, began spending 10 minutes in silence before touching rifles, began watching the environment with the focused patience of people who had discovered that the world contained information they had been ignoring. Tessa Ridley emerged as the standout. Not the most technically skilled shooter. Several men outperformed her on pure marksmanship fundamentals. But in variable conditions, when wind shifted and mirage lied, Tessa made shots that left classmates staring through their scopes. She had the gift, the ability to feel what she could not measure, to become part of the system she was trying to master. 3 months in Ilara took the class to a desert range in Nevada. Targets at 1,600 meters. 2 rounds each. 30 minutes minimum observation. The results confirmed what daily training had suggested. Students who had arrived hitting 42% of targets in variable conditions were now connecting at 67%. Because they had learned to see what had always been there. Patterns and chaos, rhythm and randomness. The 20% that technology could not reach. But while students were transforming at Coronado, resistance was building in institutional corridors where military tradition defended itself against change with considerable inertia. Master Chief Orrin Beckett sat at the head of the conference table in the Naval Special Warfare Administrative Building. 61 years old, face carved from weathered stone. He had trained more snipers than anyone else in the room, had watched his graduates succeed across every conflict since the First Gulf War. His methods were proven. His reputation was the foundation upon which the current training system had been built. And he was looking at Ilara Kincaid's performance data with the expression of a man being asked to accept that the house he built with his own hands needed renovation. 40 years of proven methodology, Beckett said, his voice carrying 4 decades of accumulated authority. You want to modify it based on 28 students in a pilot program that has been running for 90 days. Do you understand what you are asking me to accept, Chief? That 40 years of training that produced every elite sniper currently serving was somehow incomplete. That thousands of successful combat engagements were achieved with only 80% of what was needed. That is not a small claim. He looked around the table at the other senior instructors, men who had served under him, men who had taught his methods to hundreds of students who had gone on to fight in places that the American public would never know about. I have watched my graduates make shots that changed the outcome of engagements, battles, operations that altered the strategic landscape of entire regions. Those men were trained with the fundamentals I developed, the methods I refined over 30 years of iteration. And you are telling me those methods are insufficient? Ilara met his eyes. Master Chief, I have the deepest respect for what you have built. Every student who walks into my classroom arrives because your methods gave them the foundation to qualify. Without your fundamentals, my program would have nothing to build on. I am not proposing we eliminate current training. I am suggesting we add a layer, observation-based methodology, pattern recognition, environmental systems thinking, supplements, not replacements. Beckett leaned forward, his forearms on the table, his hands clasped in the way that men clasp their hands when they are holding something back. Anger, maybe, or fear. The fear that comes from the possibility that the thing you built your identity around might not be the complete structure you believed it was. Based on what evidence? Your sample size is statistically meaningless. 28 students over 3 months does not invalidate 3 decades of institutional data. Based on measurable results, Master Chief, current curriculum produces 70% hit rate in controlled conditions. That is exceptional. Your training achieves that, and I honor it. But combat reality drops that to 42% in variable conditions. That 28% gap between training and reality is where operators die, where missions fail, where the families of good men receive folded flags instead of homecoming hugs. My students, after 3 months of supplemental training, achieve 67% in variable conditions. That is a 25 percentage point improvement in operational effectiveness. She let the number settle. 25%, Master Chief. That is not a statistical anomaly. That is the difference between a platoon coming home intact and a platoon coming home with empty seats. And those are your students I am building on. Your fundamentals that make my methods possible. I am not tearing down what you built. I am adding a second story to a house that already has strong walls. Beckett was quiet for a long time. The room waited. The clock on the wall ticked with the mechanical indifference of an object that measured time without understanding what it meant to the people living inside it. How do you explain the improvement? Beckett asked, and his tone had shifted. Still skeptical, but asking a genuine question now, rather than issuing a challenge. The difference was subtle, but everyone in the room heard it. What specifically are your students doing differently that produces these results? They are choosing when to shoot, Alara said. Your curriculum teaches them how to shoot under given conditions. My supplement teaches them to identify the optimal moment within variable conditions. The mechanical skill is identical. The decision-making is different. Your graduates measure conditions at the firing line and calculate a solution based on those measurements. My students observe conditions across the entire engagement zone over time, identify cyclical patterns in wind and thermal behavior, and time their shots to the phase of the cycle that minimizes environmental interference. She pulled up a comparison video. 2 shooters engaging the same target at the same distance under identical conditions. One firing immediately after calculation. One waiting 45 seconds for a pattern to reach its stable phase. Same rifle. Same ammunition. Same distance. Same day. Same conditions. The only difference is timing. One shooter fired when the computer said to fire. The other fired when the environment said to fire. The first shot missed by 14 inches. The second was center mass. Beckett watched the video twice. The room was silent. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its combative edge, replaced by something more complex. The sound of a man whose professional identity was being challenged by evidence he could not dismiss. My graduates are not failing because they lack skill, Beckett said slowly. No, Master Chief. They are not. They are failing because they lack information that instruments cannot provide fast enough, and that only extended human observation can decode. Your methods give them 90% of what they need. I'm trying to fill the remaining gap. The philosophical clash continued for another 30 minutes, but the temperature in the room had changed. Beckett was no longer defending against attack. He was evaluating a proposal, and Alara was not trying to defeat an opponent. She was trying to recruit an ally. Finally, Naval Special Warfare Command made a decision that would settle the debate in the only language military operators trusted: performance under fire. A live fire challenge. Beckett would select his top 5 graduates from the past year. Alara would field her top 5 students. Variable conditions, 1,800 meters. The results would determine curriculum. 1 week later, a range north of San Diego. Marine layer creating fog that burned off unevenly. Wind shifting as ocean air collided with desert warmth. 10 shooters, 10 targets. Conditions that changed every few minutes with the capricious unpredictability of coastal weather interacting with inland terrain. Beckett's graduates went first. Highly trained, extensively practiced. products of a system that had produced America's finest marksmen for decades. They shot well, made adjustments competently, applied fundamentals with precision that reflected years of quality instruction. 2 out of 5 connected, 40%. Beckett watched with the composed expression of a man who recognized what he was seeing. His methods worked within their design parameters, but these conditions exceeded those parameters. Variable wind, shifting thermal patterns, the gap between measurement and reality opening and closing like a door in an unpredictable breeze. Then Alara's students took the line. They took longer to prepare. Removed boots, closed eyes, felt the wind in the ground and the thermal gradients. Some of the observers from NSW Command shifted impatiently. Beckett watched without expression, though his eyes tracked every detail of their preparation with the analytical focus of a man who had been evaluating shooters for 4 decades. He noticed things. The way one student tilted her head slightly to feel wind direction on her ear. The way another pressed his palm flat against the ground for 30 seconds before reaching for his rifle, as if the earth itself had something to communicate. The way a third student opened his eyes after 2 minutes of stillness and immediately adjusted his scope by a 1/4 minute of angle, making a correction based on nothing Beckett could see or measure, but that the student seemed absolutely certain about. These were his graduates beneath the surface, his fundamentals in every one of them. But something had been added. A layer of awareness that operated alongside the mechanical precision he had spent decades perfecting. His students measured and then shot. These students measured and then waited. And in that waiting, something shifted. Some calculation occurred that had nothing to do with mathematics and everything to do with the kind of understanding that could not be programmed into a ballistic computer or written into a training manual. The first of Alara's students fired. Hit. 1,800 meters, center mass. The spotter confirmed through his scope. The student stood without celebration, without surprise, with the quiet confidence of someone who had known the outcome before the trigger broke. The second fired. Miss. Left by 9 inches. The student accepted the result without frustration, analyzed, but had only 1 round. The miss stood. The third fired. Hit. The round striking steel with the sound that carried across the range like punctuation at the end of a sentence. The fourth fired. Hit. 3 for 4 now, and the observers from Naval Special Warfare Command were exchanging glances that communicated more than any official report would capture. The fifth was Tessa Ridley. She had been observing longer than anyone else on the range. 42 minutes. Her spotter had grown impatient after 20, had asked twice if she was ready. Both times she had shaken her head without opening her eyes. Not yet. The pattern had not fully revealed itself. Or perhaps it had, and she was waiting for the precise moment within the cycle when the fraction of a second between trigger pull and bullet arrival would encounter the least atmospheric resistance. When she finally settled behind her rifle, her movements had the unhurried grace of someone performing a task rehearsed beyond counting. She breathed, counted, waited through the build phase, through the turbulence, into the settling window. Fired. The bullet covered 1,800 meters in just over 2 seconds. Steel rang. Center mass. 4 out of 5 connected, 80%. The winning shot belonged to Tessa Ridley. 1,800 meters. First round. Center mass. She stood from prone position and turned to the observers. The wind told me when. 5 words. Beckett heard them, and something crossed his face that was not defeat. It was recognition. The same expression a master carpenter might show when seeing a new joint technique that was stronger than anything in his repertoire. Not resentment. Respect for the craft taking a form he had not imagined. Orrin Beckett walked across the range to where Alara stood. The distance between them was maybe 40 yards, but it represented a much longer journey. From skepticism to acknowledgement. From defense to openness. From 40 years of certainty to the admission that certainty itself might have limits. Chief Kincaid. He spoke slowly, each word carrying weight. I taught men to shoot. You taught them to think. There is a difference, and it took me watching your students outperform mine to see it. He extended his hand. Alara took it. Master Chief, you built the foundation everything I teach rests on. Your fundamentals work. Without them, my methods have nothing to build on. Let us teach together. Your 40 years of wisdom. My methodology. Their combination would produce something neither of us could build alone. Beckett held the handshake a moment longer than protocol required. I would like that, Chief. I genuinely would. And I would like to learn this myself. if you will teach an old man who spent too many years thinking he already knew everything worth knowing. When they released hands, the observers from Naval Special Warfare Command exchanged glances, nods. The decision had been made before the handshake ended, but the handshake was the part that would matter in the long run. 2 generations of training methodology agreeing to become one. 12 months after Yuma, the ripples continued spreading through military communities that communicated in channels civilians would never access. A documentary aired on the military channel. Serious. Unflinching. The filmmaker had spent 6 months embedded with Alara's training program. The resulting footage focused not on the spectacular shot, but on the philosophy behind it. 4.2 million views in 72 hours. Unprecedented for military content. And the response that surprised everyone came from retired veterans. Men in their 60s and 70s who had fought in Desert Storm in Panama. Men who had spent careers feeling that something was missing from their training without being able to articulate what. Men who watched Alara teach patience and observation and said, this is what we needed. This is what was missing. The formal designation came. The Kincaid Protocol. Observation Integration Training. Mandatory for all Tier 1 units. International partners requested training exchanges. British SAS, Canadian Joint Task Force 2. Australian Special Air Service Regiment. The quiet woman from Montana was changing how elite warriors trained across the globe. Brogan Hale became one of Alara's strongest advocates, an instructor now teaching her methodology with the converted conviction of a man who had been shown his own limitations and chosen growth over defense. In October, during a training mission in Syria, Hale made a 2,650-meter shot that saved 8 Marines pinned down by enemy fire. His after-action report was explicit. Utilized Kincaid reconnaissance methodology. Observed wind patterns for 40 minutes before engagement. Without Chief Kincaid demonstrating my arrogance and teaching me patience at Yuma, those Marines would have died. He wrote to Alara afterward. A letter in a plain envelope with no return address. The passage that mattered read simply, "You did not just teach me to shoot better. You taught me to be better. The men I failed to protect in earlier deployments. The guilt I carried for years. I finally honored their memory by learning the lesson you tried to teach me on a burning range in Arizona. That patience saves lives. That humility opens doors that arrogance welds shut. Thank you for not giving up on me when I gave you every reason to." Tessa Ridley deployed to Afghanistan 7 months after completing the course. Helmand Province, a region where combat still erupted despite official declarations that the war had ended. Declarations made in Washington by people who had never felt sand in their boots or heard the particular sound a bullet makes when it passes close enough to your head that your body flinches before your brain can process what happened. She was assigned to provide overwatch for a patrol of 18 soldiers moving through a valley that intelligence reports classified as moderate risk. Moderate risk in Helmand Province meant that the likelihood of enemy contact was high enough to warrant a sniper team, but not high enough to justify canceling the patrol entirely. It was the kind of mission that happened every day in places where the war was officially over, but the fighting had not received the memo. On the second day, from a concealed position on a ridge overlooking the patrol's route, Tessa identified movement at 2,240 meters. Through her scope, she could see figures moving with the deliberate coordination of men who were not farmers or herders or civilians going about daily business. They were setting up, positioning themselves along a ridge that overlooked a narrow section of the valley where the patrol would be channeled by terrain into a kill zone. An ambush. Classic L-shaped configuration. Crew-served weapon on the high ground. Riflemen along the lateral axis. If the patrol walked into it without warning, the first 30 seconds would determine whether men lived or died. And in 30 seconds, a well-executed ambush could kill half a patrol before the survivors could find cover. Tessa's spotter. A sergeant named Collins with 3 deployments and the nervous energy of a man who understood exactly what would happen if the patrol was not warned in time, urged her to engage immediately. The target was the man directing the setup. The commander. Remove him and the ambush would lose its coordination, perhaps collapse entirely. But 2,240 meters was extreme range. Wind was gusting through the mountain valley in patterns that conventional calculations would model as linear, but that Tessa could already see were anything but. Temperature was fluctuating as sun and shadow alternated across the landscape patches of cloud, moving overhead and creating thermal variations that changed air density along the bullet's path. A rushed shot at this distance had a high probability of missing, and a miss would alert the ambush team. They would accelerate their timeline. The patrol would walk into a kill zone that was now expecting resistance. The advantage of surprise would shift from Tessa to the enemy. She chose patience. The harder path. The path that felt like inaction when every instinct screamed for action. She spent 40 minutes observing, her spotter growing increasingly anxious as the patrol moved closer to the engagement zone. Collins checked his watch every 2 minutes, calculated the patrol's pace against the remaining distance, reported the shrinking margin with the controlled urgency of a man trying not to panic. They are 1,200 meters from the kill zone, 20 minutes at current pace. Tessa did not respond. She was counting wind cycles, mapping thermal patterns across the valley, watching how dust moved at different altitudes, feeling the temperature shift on her exposed cheek as clouds passed and sunlight returned. 900 meters, 15 minutes. The Taliban fighters below had settled into their positions. They were patient too, experienced. They had done this before, had probably killed coalition soldiers with this exact configuration in this exact valley. They believed they were invisible, believed the overwatch position on the ridge above them was empty. Tessa had not moved in over an hour, had not transmitted radio signals that could be intercepted, had become part of the ridge itself. 600 meters, 10 minutes. Collins's voice was tight now. Ridley, we need to engage. If we wait much longer, the patrol will be in the kill zone before we can warn them. Tessa found her window. The wind cycle she had been mapping for 40 minutes reached its stable phase. 4 seconds of relative calm in a valley full of chaos. She had already made her calculations, already adjusted for the thermal gradient, already accounted for the altitude difference between her position and the target. She fired. The bullet flew true across 2,240 meters of mountain air. The enemy commander fell. Instantly. The sound of the shot reached the ambush team 2 seconds later, echoing off valley walls in a way that made it impossible to determine its origin. The fighters looked at their fallen leader, looked at each other, looked at the ridgeline where nothing moved because Tessa had already chambered a second round without shifting her position by more than a fraction of an inch. The ambush collapsed. Fighters scattered. The crew-served weapon was abandoned. Within 90 seconds, the threat had dissolved from coordinated ambush to panicked retreat. The patrol passed through the valley without knowing how close they had come to walking into a prepared kill zone. 18 men who would go home to families who would never know that a 24-year-old woman lying on a ridge 2 kilometers away had spent 40 minutes listening to the wind so that she could fire one perfect shot at the exact moment the valley allowed it. The classified report noted that Ranger Ridley spent 40 minutes in observation before engaging target at 2,240 meters. Taliban fighters believed she had abandoned her position. Upon engagement, utilized environmental pattern recognition to achieve first-round hit. Directly attributes methodology to training received under Chief Kincaid. Military communities began calling Tessa the second ghost. She rejected the name. I am not Ghost. I am the Echo. Chief Kincaid is the voice. 20 months after the shot at Yuma, Ilara returned to Montana for the first time since her father's funeral 15 years earlier. She brought Silas with her, the old Master Chief who had been her teacher and was now learning from her, and somehow seemed younger for it, as if becoming a student again after 4 decades as a master had returned something retirement had threatened to take. They drove north from Missoula into the high country. Past the city, civilization thinned. Strip malls gave way to timber and granite and open space that made human construction seem temporary. Spruce and aspen grew thick along ridgelines. Valleys stretched between mountain ranges with patient grandeur. The road narrowed as they climbed, pavement giving way to gravel, gravel giving way to dirt. The vehicle rocking over ruts that winter had carved and spring had not yet repaired. Through the windshield, mountains rose in every direction, their peaks still holding snow that would not melt until June. The air that came through the cracked window was cold and clean, and carried the scent of pine and wet earth, and the particular freshness that existed only in places where human activity had not yet managed to replace the natural with the manufactured. Ilara drove without speaking, her hands steady on the wheel, her eyes tracking the road but also tracking the landscape the way she tracked everything, noting how the wind moved through the trees at different elevations, how cloud shadows raced across valley floors at speeds that told her about wind velocity at altitude, how the aspens that had not yet leafed out swayed in patterns that revealed air currents invisible to anyone who did not know how to read them. This was the landscape that had made Ilara Kincaid. Not the Navy, not SEAL training, not Silas Holden's 8 years of instruction. This The wind that moved through these valleys with voices only certain people could hear. The silence that taught lessons no classroom could contain. The vast beauty of a natural world that rewarded observation and punished assumption. Silas watched her drive and recognized something he had seen before. The particular stillness that settled over her when she returned to a place that held deep personal meaning. She had the same look on her face that she wore behind a rifle scope. Total focus. Total presence. The world narrowing to what mattered, and everything else falling away. They parked where the road ended and walked the final mile on foot. A trail that was barely a trail, more a suggestion of passage through timber and scrub that had been walked just enough times over 15 years to keep the brush from reclaiming it entirely. Alara led. Silas followed, his knees protesting the uphill grade, but his determination outpacing the pain. Emmett Kincaid's grave sat on a remote ridge above a valley he had loved. No formal cemetery. Just a place he had chosen years before his death, telling his daughter during a hike when she was 10 years old that this was where he wanted to rest. Where the wind would always find him. Where the elk would pass below in autumn, and the eagles would circle above in spring, and the aspens would turn gold every September, the way they had turned gold every September for 10,000 years before he was born. A simple stone marker bearing his name. His years. Nothing about his service or sacrifice. He would not have wanted that. Emmett Kincaid had been a man who believed that what you did mattered more than what was written about what you did. Alara knelt beside the grave, the ground cold through her pants. Late March in Montana meant winter still held the high country releasing slowly. She placed a challenge coin on the stone. The Yuma commemorative. One side showed the target with a bullet hole dead center. The other bore an inscription small enough that you had to hold it close to read. Patience defeats distance. Silas stood a respectful distance away. Close enough to be present. Far enough to give her privacy. He had lost his own father at 23. A mining accident in West Virginia. He understood what it meant to stand at a grave and wish you could report your accomplishments to the person who made them possible. He had met Emmett Kincaid once briefly at a shooting competition in Wyoming 18 years ago when Alara was still a child and her father was still alive. And the future that would unfold from that Montana childhood was still just potential stored in a girl who could feel the wind change direction before it happened. Silas had recognized in the quiet rancher the same quality he would later recognize in the man's daughter. The ability to be still in a world that rewarded noise. The patience to observe when everyone around you was acting. He would be proud, Ghost Silas said softly. Alara touched the stone, her fingers tracing letters carved deep enough to outlast weather and time. He knew this would happen. Told me when I was 8 years old. Standing right here on this ridge watching elk move across that valley. He said someday I would teach warriors to stop fighting the wind and start listening to it. I thought he was being poetic. Using a metaphor the way fathers do when they want to say something important, but do not want to make it sound heavy. She paused, her breath visible in the cold air. He was not being poetic. He meant it literally. He saw something in me that I did not see in myself for another 20 years. Silas nodded. Good teachers do that. Plant seeds without explaining what will grow. Trust the soil. Trust the seasons. Trust that what they have planted will find its way to the surface when the time is right. A voice interrupted from behind them. Young, curious. The particular clarity that children's voices carried in mountain air. Miss Kincaid, they turned. A girl stood at the edge of the clearing. Maybe 9 years old. She wore hiking clothes purchased for function, sturdy boots, a fleece jacket, binoculars around her neck that were not toys but actual field glasses. Her father, a park ranger based on his uniform, stood a few yards behind her, his expression carrying recognition and the deliberate decision to let his daughter approach. Can I help you? Alara asked, her voice gentle in a way it rarely was in professional settings. You are the sniper from the news, the one who made the impossible shot. The girl's voice carried the certainty children possess before the world teaches them to qualify everything. I am a sniper. Yes. Can you teach me to shoot like you? Alara looked at this girl who stood on the same ridge where she had stood 30 years ago, who carried binoculars the way Alara had carried them at the same age, who looked at the world with the same focused attention that Emmett Kincaid had recognized in his daughter and spent years cultivating before a mountain took him away. She knelt, bringing her eyes level with the girl's. I can teach you to listen. Shooting comes after listening, a long time after. She reached down, picked up an aspen leaf from the ground near her father's grave. Brown and curled from winter, but still intact. Close your eyes. Hold this leaf in your open palm. Tell me when the wind will shift. The girl, whose name was Sparrow, according to the embroidered patch on her jacket, showing a sparrow in flight and whose father's ranger tag read, Finch, took the leaf, closed her eyes, extended her hand. Her face showed intense concentration. The kind of focus that came naturally to children before society taught them to distribute attention across screens and notifications. Pure focus, undiluted. 30 seconds passed. The mountain was silent. Wind moved through the aspens with the whisper it had carried for 10,000 years. 40 seconds. Now, Sparrow said. The wind shifted. The aspen leaves overhead rustled in a new direction, the change sweeping across the ridge like an invisible hand turning a page. Ilara smiled, a genuine expression so rare that Silas, who had known her for a decade and stood beside her in combat and watched her make the most remarkable shot in modern military history, could count the times he had seen it on one hand. You are a natural. How did you know? The leaf got heavier right before, like the wind was gathering itself, collecting itself before it changed direction, like a breath before speaking. That is exactly right. The wind gathers before it shifts, compresses before it releases, pauses before it moves. Just like everything else in nature. Ilara looked up at the girl's father. The ranger stood watching with an expression that combined pride and wonder. Sir, if you are willing, I would like to work with your daughter. Teach her to read the environment. Not shooting, just observation. Patience. The foundation that everything else is built on. Ranger Finch nodded. She has been watching the natural world since she could walk. Noticing things other people miss. Predicting weather changes before they happen. If you can help her develop that, I would be grateful. Ilara stood. Handed Sparrow a card. Have your father reach out. We will start when the snow melts. As Sparrow and her father walked away down the trail, the girl turned back once, waved. The gesture carrying the uncomplicated warmth of a child who had just met someone she recognized as the same kind of person she was. Silas watched the exchange, starting them young, building the next generation. Ilara looked back at her father's grave, the challenge coin catching the last light of afternoon. My father did the same for me. I was 4 when he first brought me here. 8, when he started teaching me to read wind with intention. By the time I was her age, I could predict weather changes hours before they happened. I did not know it was unusual. I thought everyone could feel the wind gather before it shifted. She paused, the valley below glowing gold as the sun descended. This is how it continues. Not through institutions or official programs. Those matter. They spread the knowledge. But the seed is planted here. One teacher, one student, one leaf held in an open hand, one moment of recognition that what seems impossible is just something no one has taught you to see yet. They stood in silence, the kind of quiet that felt full rather than empty, the silence that exists between people who have shared enough that words become optional. The sun moved. Shadows lengthened. The temperature dropped as afternoon shifted toward evening. Somewhere in the valley, elk moved through timber in patterns that followed terrain and wind, and the accumulated wisdom of a species that had been reading this landscape for millennia. Silas spoke. You changed how wars are fought, Ghost, by being the best teacher, by showing that patience matters more than speed, that understanding matters more than equipment, that the 20% technology cannot reach is the 20% that determines whether missions succeed or fail, whether people live or die. Ilara shook her head. I did not change anything, Master Chief. I revealed what was always possible, what was always there waiting for someone to stop measuring long enough to notice it. Montana taught me. My father prepared me. You refined me. Afghanistan tested me. I am just the messenger. The voice is the wind. I am just the person who learned its language and found a way to teach it. Best messengers become legends, Silas replied. And you, Chief Kincaid, are a legend walking this earth. They walked back toward the vehicle as the last light left the sky, and the first stars appeared above the ridgeline. The same stars that had watched over this valley when Emmett Kincaid taught his daughter to feel the wind shift. The same stars that would watch over it long after every person in this story had joined Emmett under the Montana soil. At the ridge crest, Ilara stopped, turned back one final time. The valley stretched below. Vast. Patient. Eternal in a way that human achievements could never be. Wind moved through the aspens with the same whisper it had always carried. the same language it had always spoken, available to anyone willing to stand still long enough to hear it, available to a little girl with binoculars, available to a woman with a rifle, available to anyone who understood that the most powerful force in the world was not strength or speed or technology or the ability to send a bullet 2.5 miles through hostile air. The most powerful force was the silence before the shot, the patience to wait, the wisdom to observe, the humility to listen, the understanding that you were not separate from the world you were trying to master, but part of it, that the wind was not your enemy, but your teacher, that the desert was not your opponent, but your partner, that the 20% no instrument could measure was the 20% that made the difference between failing and succeeding, between being good and being something that transcended good and entered the territory where skill became art and art became legacy. Elara Kincaid had made one impossible shot on an August afternoon in Arizona, a bullet that flew 4,000 meters through hostile atmosphere and struck a target that had defeated every shooter who had ever attempted it. That shot would be remembered, studied, analyzed, debated in military classrooms for generations. But her real legacy was not the bullet. It was the silence that preceded it. The 6 minutes of observation while men assumed she was failing. The patience to gather knowledge when others rushed toward action. The willingness to sacrifice one round for certainty rather than spending 2 on hope. And it was the girl on the ridge, Sparrow, 9 years old, holding an aspen leaf in her open palm with her eyes closed, feeling the wind gather before it shifted, learning the first lesson of a language that would take a lifetime to master, and that was worth every minute of the learning. The wind blew, the aspens whispered, the stars brightened in a sky that stretched from horizon to horizon without a single artificial light to diminish their ancient testimony. And somewhere in the space between a grave on a Montana ridge and a steel target in an Arizona canyon, between a father who planted a seed and a daughter who grew it into something that changed how warriors trained across the world, between 13 men who failed and one woman who succeeded because she understood what they had not yet learned to see, the impossible rested quietly. Not defeated, not conquered, just redefined, by a woman who knew that the answer had never been in the rifle. It had always been in the wind.